So this week we will be choosing an individual, and I'm going to give you some hints and some direction, I suppose, on what to look for when you choose an individual. Now, the booklet starts off with historical context, but every year I start with choosing an individual, and this refers to pages 34 to pages 39 in the booklet. So, how do we choose an individual? Okay, so the issue we're looking at for this essay is the role of the individual. So, this lesson we're going to look at what makes an individual significant, some things to look for when choosing an individual for the essay. We'll look at some good and bad examples, and then we'll think about where to go from here. Okay, so it's all about the individual in this lesson. So if we look at the diagram of the paragraphs in our essay, you can see that this lesson refers directly to the paragraph biography of an individual in your essay, which is the second body paragraph of the essay. Okay, so let's get started. What makes an individual important in history? Some individuals are more important than others in history. Everybody knows Marie Antoinette, who lost her head in France. Everybody knows Ned Kelly in Australia. Well, most people should know about Ned Kelly. Everybody knows Vladimir Lenin from the Russian Revolution, or Stalin. Everybody knows Stalin, and everybody knows Hitler. These are examples of very significant individuals in history. Not everybody knows Irving Sayles. I know who that was because I'm a theatre historian, but not everybody knows Irving. Not everybody knows Stan Kavanagh, who was a famous juggler. I know him because I'm a juggler, but not everybody knows him. So Stan and Irving wouldn't be really good topics for this essay. So what we're looking at are people like Genghis Khan, people who were famous in history and who changed history and who are somewhat controversial in history. Okay, have a think about that. So some questions you should ask yourself when you choose somebody are they a controversial figure? In your essay, you must find at least two perspectives on your individual. Now, the perspectives don't have to be all good or bad. They could be just different ideas about the individual's importance or how they handled an issue. Secondly, you've got to think about, is there a lot of information available about them? You might pick a great individual, but there may not be much information about them. That will make it difficult for you. And then you have to think about, are they really a significant figure? Did they influence the course of historical events in their country and around the world? So let's look at some examples. Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is a really significant figure in history, but he's quite difficult to find information about because all the information about Martin Luther King is held by his family, and they're very strict on what they let get published about him. So it's quite difficult to find information that has a different perspective other than Martin Luther King was a saint. Okay, so he's a bit hard to find information about, even though he is a major significant figure in history. Alexander the Great is another one who's difficult to find information about because he's known as Alexander the Great. So it's hard to find people who don't talk about Alexander being great. Okay, so you have to look for things like that. As far as Alexander the Great's concerned, I have done an essay on Alexander the Great with a student, and we found one lone historian who talks about the effect of Alexander the Great from the perspective of the Persian people and the people whose lands he invaded, which gave a completely different perspective on Alexander the Great. But that was quite difficult to find. But you see what I mean, right? You need to find somebody who there are different perspectives on. Okay, let's look at Charlie Chaplin. Do you know Charlie Chaplin? He was a very famous silent movie star. You might recognise him from this postcard. Now, Charlie Chaplin was a significant figure in the film industry. He revolutionised film. And he was also controversial because he was accused of being a communist. And he also had some affairs with some very, very young women. So he was controversial. But if you use Charlie Chaplin, you have to think about, is he a significant historical figure? Now, you could possibly make the argument he was, but it might be difficult. Okay, so did he have an impact on history? Maybe he did in the film industry. I don't know, but it would be something to think about. Okay, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill was Prime Minister of England during the Second World War. And he was also First Lord of the Admiralty, which is the Navy, during the Gallipoli campaign. In fact, this lovely gentleman sitting here was the man who sent the Australians to Gallipoli to their slaughter, basically. Now, there are two views of Churchill written by qualified historians. One historian who's written about him is, believe it or not, English Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And Johnson wrote about Churchill for his thesis at Cambridge, right? So Johnson is actually a credible historian. But of course, Boris Johnson thinks Winston Churchill was an absolute hero who saved the British during the Second World War. And a lot of people agree with him about that. However, Australian historian Graham Freudenberg analyses Churchill from the Australian point of view. And he suggests that Churchill was not so heroic after all. So Freudenberg actually says that yes, Churchill was good during the war, but he wasn't very good to Australia. And one of my students wrote an essay that used Freudenberg as a reference and talked about how Churchill sent the Australians to Gallipoli to be slaughtered, and also how he actually, and this is historical fact, how Churchill would not support the Australians in the war against Japan. Churchill was quite willing to let Australia go in the Second World War, so he basically deserted us, and the Americans had to come and rescue us. So Churchill is a controversial figure if you look at him from the Australian perspective and from the British perspective. Another example that a student used earlier this year was Joan of Arc. Now, this student compared Catholic historians with feminist historians and how they saw Joan of Arc. Now, Joan of Arc was a young woman who fought in the 100 Years' War, and she was very young, she was a teenager, and she led the French army to victory against the English, but she was captured and burnt at the stake as a witch, basically, because Joan believed she heard the voices of God. Now, Catholic historians say that Joan was a saint who did actually hear voices from God, and that her victories in the war were due to God looking after her. But comparing that with feminist historians who say that Joan was just a young woman who was somewhat disturbed, and she was exploited by the men around her as a way to motivate the army. So as you can see, this is a more subtle approach. It's talking about different perspectives rather than just good or bad perspectives. Okay, so where do you go from here? The key step in your journey to writing this essay is to choose an individual who's a little bit controversial. So think about that, and by the end of the week you should have an individual. So try and commit by the end of the week. There's a timeline in the book for you to write about your individual's life, which will help you write the biography paragraph in the essay. You might like to look at some resources and books in the TAFE library or your local library. And you might like to look at the website of the State Library of New South Wales. Now, the State Library of New South Wales has a wonderful catalogue, and on the front page you can just search for your individual and you can filter the search and it will take you directly to online, full text references online. It's much better than using ProQuest. So you do have to join the library, but it's free, and they give you a number, and it will take you to full text articles on the internet, and it's a brilliant, brilliant source to have. So basically what I think you should do by the end of the week is choose an individual. So you have to choose an individual and also have a couple of historians in mind. Okay, now if you need help with that, you can drop me a line and tell me which individual you're thinking about. I've got a fairly broad knowledge of several individuals and historians who talk about them. So just drop me a line and let me know who you choose by the end of the week. Okay? All right, well, I look forward to hearing from you, and I look forward to learning about your individual. I hope you do too. Bye.